From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
President Biden tests positive for COVID-19. We'll talk about what that means for his ability to operate as president. Plus, Congress is back, and it may even do something productive. Well, or maybe not. A bipartisan group of senators agrees on a reform of the Electoral Count Act of 1887, which created the famous loophole that lets members of Congress think they can challenge the results of presidential elections. We'll look at the details of the draft agreement and let you know if it's an improvement. Plus, the Senate is moving on a bill to subsidize the U.S. semiconductor industry. But as always, Congress wants more and more and more. We'll talk about that. Welcome, all of you, on this Potomac Watch podcast. I'm Paul Gigot, and I'm here with my colleagues Kim Strassel and Kyle Peterson. Great to have both of them with us. Kim, quickly, President's COVID-19 diagnosis, not a surprise. Really, eventually he was going to get it. Everybody seems to be getting it. Good news is mild symptoms, and of course, he'll get the best health care.
Yeah, and look, cases are rising again everywhere with this new variant. The good news is that while this variant seems to be even more highly transmissible, it is not necessarily ending up in tons of hospitalizations in the ways that we've seen some of the very earliest versions. The White House says the president, as you said, mild symptoms. He's going to isolate in the White House. They claim that he is still feeling well enough that he'll be able to continue carrying out his duties on the phone, etc. A couple of trips had to be delayed, but so far it doesn't seem to be causing any major disruption.
Yeah, one of the things that we've been finding with these new variants is that while they spread more readily, they are much less lethal. And even people who are in the president's age group, upper 70s, 80s, I know at least two people in their 90s who have had COVID and come out of it pretty well. So we will, of course, watch that closely. Let's move on to the Electoral Count Act proposal. At long last, 18 months after the January 6th debacle, the Senate group, bipartisan group, has put together a bill that would reform the Electoral Count Act. The senators are led by Joe Manchin and Susan Collins, and the basis for this is that it wasn't just Donald Trump. He wasn't the first to use this law to think he could challenge and maybe change the results of elections. Democrats in Congress have challenged the election of 2000. They challenged 2004. They challenged it in 2016, and they did so in ways that were less aggressive than Donald Trump. Most people do things less aggressively than Donald Trump does everything. But nonetheless, it's a bad precedent and principle. Let's listen to Joe Manchin and Susan Collins talk about the bill.
The confusing and antiquated language that we have on the books today from the 1887 Electoral Count Act is a real and present danger to our democracy. We can fix that, and that's exactly what we intend to do. The increased threats and attacks we're seeing across the country on poll workers and election volunteers, we can fix that too. But even more important than the policy provisions contained in these two bills is the fact that we have Democrats and Republicans standing arm in arm, proposing common sense election reforms that can begin to restore Americans' faith in our democracy.
4 of the past 6 presidential elections, this process has been abused, with members of both parties raising frivolous objections to electoral votes. But it took the violent breach of the Capitol on January 6th of 2021 to really shine a spotlight on the urgent need for reform.
Kyle, you've been digging into the legislative language and talking to folks. Is this an improvement, this draft, this proposal on the Electoral Count Act?
I think it is an improvement, and let me start with how the process works right now. So when Congress gathers on January 6th to count the electoral votes, they go state by state. And under the current language of the Electoral Count Act, if there's an objection that is signed by one senator and one representative, that's enough to halt the counting, and the House and the Senate have to break, they have to debate, they have to vote on the objection. And it has become very corrosive because, as Senator Collins says, in 4 out of the last 6 presidential elections, somebody has raised some kind of phony objection. We all know what was raised in 2020, in 2004, after the 2004 election. It was the voting machines in Ohio. And I think it's pretty corrosive to public confidence to see this sort of stuff, people grandstanding for the C-SPAN cameras in that way. So what the bill would do is, in order to hear an objection, you would have to have 1/5 of the House sign it and 1/5 of the Senate, which is a much higher threshold. But more importantly, the bill says that Congress is not allowed to reject electoral votes simply because it doesn't like what happened in the states with mail ballots or with voting machines. It says that if there is a slate of electors that is certified by the governor, that slate shall be treated as conclusive. And so that's really important, I think. My nitpick on this is that it still allows objections if the senator, the representative, thinks that the elector's vote wasn't regularly given, which is a kind of a term of art, but that is exactly the same term of art that Congress has been abusing for the past 20 years. And so, to my mind, the ultimate fix, and this is what we've argued in editorials, the ultimate fix ought to be to get rid of this objection process altogether. The one branch of government that passed the 2020 Trump test with flying colors was the judiciary, which heard a lot of these cases and rejected these flimsy fraud claims. And so to my mind, the better solution would be to let the judiciary handle all of this stuff. Because as long as you have a process in place for Congress to reject electoral votes, you're sending a signal to partisans that even after the November voting is done, the election isn't really over because something can still happen in Congress. And I think that's a real bad signal to send. And January 6th last year, the Capitol riot is a good example of why.
I agree with you totally on the regularly given language. And that's not going to stop a Josh Hawley or somebody on the left, AOC or somebody from grandstanding. But because of the limitations and definitions of what in this draft bill, of what constitutes a legitimate challenge, these challenges, even under this new bill, are much more likely to be dispatched in quick order, as I understand it. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think that's true. If the House and the Senate broke to debate this objection, one of their responses could be if a Josh Hawley or a Maxine Waters or someone was raising issues about voting machines in Ohio or mail ballots, other senators, other members of the House could say, listen, look at the language of the law. We don't have the authority to reject electors on that basis, and they could vote it down. I guess my point is just that part of the problem that we've seen, it really only blew up after the 2020 election, but part of the problem we've seen since 2000 was people getting into the well of the House and making these phony objections, saying they didn't like what the voting machines in Ohio did in 2004, saying they didn't like Russia's interference with the election in 2016, and grandstanding for the cameras, for their supporters, trying to fundraise off of that, showing their partisans that they're fighting. And to my mind, part of the deal with this reform should be to end that incentive, or I guess you can't end the incentive to grandstand, but take away the opportunity for partisans to grandstand in that way.
I agree with you entirely, Kyle, and we have editorialized in that. Take Congress out of this. The language in the Constitution is clear enough that the states themselves should certify these electoral votes, and Congress shouldn't play a role because the incentive is so great for Congress to intervene. But this is Congress, Kim, and Congress doesn't like to give up power when it sees an opportunity. So I guess there's got to be some opposition here from Congress saying, oh, well, please don't take us out of it altogether, which is unfortunate. But one other good thing, and I guess they were only too happy to be able to take power from somebody else, which in this case is justified, and that is this draft would stipulate that the vice president's role is purely ministerial, so that he would not, in counting the votes, presiding over the session of Congress where the votes are counted, he would not be able to do what Donald Trump claimed Mike Pence could have done, which was to essentially stop the vote counting.
Right, and which, by the way, was also an enormous factor in that mob that we saw on January 6th in the 2020 election, as the stakes had been heightened for Pence and the pressure elevated on him by the president. You know, even in that rally and speech he gave just a couple of hours before on the day, really coming down hard. And that was what provoked a lot of people to go and attack and assault at the Capitol, because they believed that the vice president hadn't stepped up and saved the day for Donald Trump. So this bill totally clarifies that, says that this is just a ceremonial role. One other thing that I think is a good piece of it, too, is it also goes at this question of separate or rival slates of electors. And Kyle briefly touched on this, but it clarifies that Congress can only accept a slate of electors that is submitted by the governor of a state. That was something else we saw in the most recent election. Other officials in the states trying to mount up rival slates of electors and try to get those results to Congress as a way of changing what had actually been certified by the actual state machinery. And so this is just one more tiny piece that should try to ward off some of the problems we've seen growing in recent years.
All right, we're going to take a break, and when we come back, we'll have more on the Electoral Count Act reform attempt and some semiconductor subsidy follies in the Senate when we come back.
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome back. I'm Paul Gigot with the Wall Street Journal, here with the esteemed ones, Kyle Peterson and Kim Strassel. We're talking about the Electoral Count Act and reforming it in the Senate, that there's a bipartisan group of senators who put together a proposed bill. And we're talking about the details. And Kyle, taking off from where Kim left, when you have the slate of electors chosen by a governor, signified, what happens in a case under this legislation if you get a rogue governor? Let's say you've got a governor of Pennsylvania where the popular vote went for the Democrat, but you have a Republican governor who says, I'm not going to certify that. I think that he could say whatever excuse he wanted. And he submits a set of electors which goes for the candidate who lost the popular vote. What happens then?
So it's a little unclear what happens then according to this legislation, because the legislation says that the governor's slate of electors is the one that Congress has to count. And so if the governor simply refuses to do his duty, there'd be some sort of lawsuits in here. I've seen some people float the idea that maybe the courts should be allowed to certify in place of the governor if the governor refuses to certify the actual winning slate of electors. And I'm not so sure about that idea if there are federalism problems with that. But it does seem like a little bit of a remote possibility to me, because if a governor went down this route, you would have, I think, lawsuits in state court. You might have the governor being held in contempt of court. In some states, you might have state law might provide for this eventuality. There's some states, for example, that if a body refuses to certify, a court can issue a writ of mandamus and require them to certify. We saw that with a couple of local officials, local boards in New Mexico recently. Or there are some states that I believe have in their law situations where if the governor or somebody who's supposed to certify refuses to do that duty can then flow down to the next person in line. And the language in this Electoral Count Act reform bill says that it doesn't actually say governor. It says it's the state's executive who is required to certify. And so that does leave a little bit of room for states to determine who would fill that role in given situations.
Well, wait a minute. If you had a rogue governor, the vice presidential candidate or presidential or vice presidential candidates who are done wrong by that, say they prevailed in a popular vote, the governor went the other way, they would have a chance under this legislation to file a lawsuit in court. And would the courts have the last word on that?
Well, the courts would have a last word on whether they are correct or not, whether they won the slate or not. And for any sort of dispute about electors, this legislation would set up a streamlined path to the Supreme Court. So a aggrieved presidential candidate or vice presidential candidate would get a hearing initially in front of a 3-judge panel, and then the expedited appeal from that would go straight to the Supreme Court. And so it does help by streamlining that path. The question that you're asking about a rogue governor is a little bit more complicated, because it's not clear, at least to me legally, whether a federal court or the U.S. Supreme Court can order a governor to take an action if the governor is refusing to do so. So that might play out in state court, and according to state law, like I was saying earlier about whether there's any sort of provision in state law to allow that authority to waterfall down to the next person if the governor refuses to play ball. But again, I think we're talking about a pretty remote eventuality here, given that if it was clear that the electors were won by one party and the governor went completely rogue and said, I'm going to certify electors for the other party, it seems like there would be a pretty serious popular uprising against that too.
Yes, that's probably right. But under the Electoral Count Act, we didn't have a problem with this from 1887 when it passed until the year 2000. And now we've had 20 years of problems, most seriously in 2020. So, I mean, never underestimate the conniving ability of politicians to take advantage of a loophole. I mean, I'm sorry, I don't think that comment, harsh as it may seem, begins to plumb the depths of political cynicism that people are capable of. So I think you're probably right. This would happen very rarely, but I could see a situation where you have essentially an outgoing governor who is leaving office and not going to have any more political career anyway and decides, you know what, I'm going to be a hero to my voters by going this direction. So the question for me is, how does that end up? Does the Supreme Court decide on which electors are counted? Or if there's a dispute, does Congress basically have to not include those electors?
Well, I think the federal courts and state courts would decide who is the correct winner of the electors. Again, I think some of this depends on what state law is and whether there is a provision in state law to force someone to certify the correct slate of electors. But the other eventuality is you could get into this situation where it gets to Congress, and maybe that's why the writers of this bill wanted to leave in that sort of catch-all language about regularly given, is maybe they wanted to leave themselves some wiggle room in case some situation like this or something that we're not even entertaining today came up.
All right, Kim, what are the prospects that this is going to pass?
It's been kind of remarkable just how few people have worked on this because it's such a central issue. In my mind, it is the most important thing, a lot more important than a lot of things we're hearing coming out of the January 6th Commission, which is looking backward. This is looking forward to try to stop another situation like this. The main bill that we've been discussing, because there's actually two here, there's another one dealing with election security, but this one reforms the Electoral Count Act. It currently has 9 Republican co-sponsors and 7 Democratic co-sponsors. Now, it was a smaller group that put it together. Apparently, they have got word from the head of the Rules Committee, as Senator Amy Klobuchar, that she is going to hold a hearing on this probably in August, which means that it's going to get aired, and it doesn't look as though it's going to get fast-tracked, but this might be the right way for it to go, allow members to become more familiar with its language, and hopefully you end up getting the necessary Republicans, which is 10, because you'd have to overcome a filibuster, and all the Democrats. I think that it has a chance, especially if the leaders of both parties really push it and make it a priority, but it is a little concerning that so far it just seems to be something that's been out there and not necessarily a central focus.
Well, and I think it's been actually irresponsible of the January 6th committee not to focus at all on this. You know, they've been so focused on nailing Donald Trump that they haven't focused nearly enough, put nearly enough attention on what could be done to prevent this sort of thing from happening again. All right, we'll follow it, but let's briefly take up this question of the semiconductor bill, Kim. $52 billion in grants, $24 billion in tax credits for the not-so-impoverished semiconductor industry, including companies like Intel, Advanced Micro Devices. The Senate voted on bipartisan fashion to break the 60-vote threshold. And then suddenly, an amendment was offered by none other than Chuck Schumer, and the bill ballooned to $250 billion. So speaking of cynicism, what happened?
Yeah, only in Washington. Basically, what happened is Chuck Schumer and Democrats saw an opportunity to link arms with spend-happy Republicans and boost this bill way up and turn it into what they're now calling a CHIPS Plus bill. And so now this bill, instead of being, corporate welfare for the semiconductor industry, is now being fashioned as some giant bill to increase U.S. innovation overall, namely by dumping hundreds of billions of dollars into the federal government. So the National Science Foundation is now going to get $81 billion. The Commerce Department is going to get $11 billion to set up 20 or so regional technology hubs. The National Institute of Standards and Technology, and yes, there is such an outfit, is getting $10 billion for goodness knows what. And then the Energy Department is also getting tens of billions of dollars. So the remarkable thing to me, Paul, is that the 16 Republicans who voted to proceed on the semiconductor portion of this look ready to go along with this, which to me is epically dumb in terms of politics, but also policy.
The principle here to which I adhere, at least always have when it comes to this kind of spending, is if it's for pure research, that's an important role for government. So if you're spending money on biotech research, pure research, molecules, digital things, okay, that seems to be justified because you won't have private spending on those sorts of things because the returns are speculative and long-term. Where I have a real problem is when you get what becomes corporate welfare, when you have direct subsidies to firms, or when you have government deciding, okay, Commerce Department, let's set up some regional hubs. We'll call them technology hubs and innovation hubs. We'll give you a lot of money, and then some bureaucratic process will be set up to distribute those. Now, who do you think gets those? People with political connections. The fact that they're setting up 20 regional hubs is a classic Congress. Let's spread them around the country so we can get more votes for the bill. It's like public broadcasting. We need a public broadcasting studio in every city across the country. Why do you think that is? More votes. Again, I mean, you have to say, do we really need this amount of money? Kim, your last word.
Yeah, the word that you should always be wary of in Washington is when they say they're going to engage in partnerships with business. And that word is spread all throughout this legislation. And it's an excellent point that you make that this won't necessarily be going to hire a new government scientist. And I would even debate the wisdom of some of those, but rather it's just a way of funneling more money to corporate America, those who can pay to have the most lobbyists. And so therefore those who are probably least deserving as well too. This is a classic boondoggle, and I can only hope that Republicans in the Senate and the House come to their senses.
Thank you, Kim. Thank you, Kyle. Thank you all for listening. We're here every day now on Potomac Watch. You can send your suggestions, criticisms, what have you, to pwpodcast@wsj.com. Glad to have you with us, and please join us tomorrow for another edition of Potomac Watch.